Violence and disruptive behavior from your employees is up next on Employment Law After Hours.
Welcome back to the second episode in this 5-part series of Deviance in the Workplace. On this episode, we're bringing back Amanda Waesch. Welcome back, Amanda.
Thanks for having me back.
And we are talking about disruptive behavior in the workplace. So what's it look like when your employees throw fists? But before we do that, we need to just do a quick disclaimer. You can see it below in our description, but the three of us are attorneys in the law firm of Brennan, Manna, and Diamond, but we are not yet your attorneys. What happens when your employees square up in the workplace?
Well, hopefully they're not throwing fists, but sometimes they do. In the healthcare world, I would characterize disruptive behavior or violence in the workplace into two categories. One is violence, actual violence, which should never be tolerated. And the second would be the disruptive behavior, the harassing behavior, the belittling, the yelling, the menacing, threatening. That is all lumped together under disruptive behavior, and that should not be tolerated. So my fun stories are going to involve employees in the workplace. They may also involve non-employees. So in healthcare, we have hospitals, and they may not employ physicians directly, but physicians are on their medical staff. We may not be governed by the employee handbook in that situation. We may be governed by the medical staff bylaws, but the concepts are still the same, right? Disruptive behavior should not be tolerated, and violence in the workplace should never be tolerated. We can start with disruptive behavior. So that's the angry physician, right?
Sure.
Right? I mean, and physicians sometimes get a bad rap for their anger management issues. I've had physicians look menacing. So I've had physicians that are bodybuilders actually flex their muscles and attempt to threaten patients or threaten other employees if they don't get their way. I've had physicians say belittling things, especially to nurses, like you're stupid, you don't know what you're talking about, just some, just really derogatory things. And again, I'm not talking about racial slurs or sexual harassment because that's an entirely different category, but I'm talking about disruptive behavior that is just not conducive to teamwork and in the healthcare world can impact patient care.
I mean, I could see a situation where a doctor is just fully aggressive towards a nurse during surgery, and that's just going to completely throw the vibe of the surgery room off.
So if it's a physician who's a medical staff member, we need to follow the medical staff bylaws. But if you are the hospital, you're the employer. So you need to protect your staff because that could rise to the level of harassment or hostile work environment, and we do not need to subject our employees to that type of behavior.
Yeah, even above and beyond that, from an employer standpoint, if you have a employee who's being aggressive or violent towards another employee, you could be liable if you fail to investigate or otherwise remedy that conduct. Every employer should have a handbook policy on violence in the workplace and how to, one, prevent it, two, let employees know, again, as Amanda just said, it's unacceptable, and three, that you are going to investigate and fully remedy any violence in the workplace.
Just one more thing to piggyback off of that. It's really important that those policies also have protections for people who are coming to you, the employer, to say, look, I have this problem, I have someone who has threatened me, who's being abusive, or I see this as a third party happening between two of my colleagues. You want to make sure that as an employer, you're protecting someone who is coming to you.
We talked about disruptive behavior. Now let's talk about violence because those are, some of the more serious examples that I have. So I've had a physician throw a stapler at a nurse during a surgical procedure because he did not like the way that she did something. So he just decided to throw things, including a very big stapler. I've had a physician actually strangle a nurse because he didn't like the way that she was stocking a shelf.
0 to 10.
Yes,
Real fast.
Went really, yes. And then my worst example that I just really hate is I actually had a physician stab a surgical nurse with a syringe. And thank goodness it was a syringe that didn't have anything in it. It hadn't been used on the patient, but he just picked up a syringe and stabbed her multiple times.
Yeah, what was the aftermath of that?
Blood.
Well,
chaos.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. The aftermath was nobody wanted to report it, which is the worst reaction that you could ever have. Obviously, we had violations of medical staff bylaws. We had violations of the employee handbook, violations of the law. Yeah. We had, reporting obligations to the licensure board, and nobody wanted to report it because they were worried about the ramifications. And so what that taught us more about the culture. So we took a good look at ourselves and said, we have a policy, but we're not educating our employees and our medical staff members about the policy and about whistleblower protections. We implemented a hotline. We made sure and educated about the hotline, that there was no ramification for reporting, and that this behavior should not be tolerated.
It is important that you inform your employees, hey, if you are dealing with an aggressive or hostile, disruptive employee towards you, you can whistleblow, come to us, let us know those issues, and we're not going to punish you, even if the allegations turn out to be unfounded.
I have had instances of violence against patients. When you have violence against patients, that's a whole nother level, because there's a whole nother reporting obligation that you have, because healthcare providers are supposed to keep their patients safe. But I've had healthcare workers punch patients, give patients drugs to sedate them or restrain them, not in accordance with the policy. How the organization responds to that will tell you a lot about their culture. Mm-hmm. So if they rally around the person and say, well, we're tired of dealing with these patients, that tells you, okay, well, maybe we need to do something to protect our employees don't feel protected, but sure, our patients should also feel protected as well. So it is, it teaches you in those types of crisis situations, it does teach you a lot about your culture.
And you don't want to get that reputation as an employer in the community that you are not, dealing with these situations, because as we've seen time and time again, employees will go to social media, tell the news that, hey, you're pushing under the rug, these violent situations, and otherwise not addressing them.
So in the first episode, we talked about impairment, and impairment has a duty to report, but also allow that person to rehabilitate themselves. When you talk about disruptive behavior and when you talk about violence, you should have a zero tolerance policy.
100%.
There should be absolutely no wiggle room. It should not be tolerated, should not be allowed. But when it comes to disruptive behavior, and you talked about going from 0 to 10, very quickly, that person may need an opportunity to rehabilitate themselves through some additional education. Again, you should keep that person on a short leash, because what we know in healthcare is that you should have a zero tolerance policy, because it does impact not only your culture, but patient care.
If you're dealing with a situation where an employee has been violent or disruptive, and then you say, hey, we're investigating you, it turns out you did this conduct, we need to terminate you, and at that point they say, well, hold on, I have high anxiety and depression that leads to these anger issues.
Interesting.
You do not, at that point, need to necessarily accommodate them. You can still move forward with the termination, because they didn't come to you before that aggressive, violent conduct. They came to you after the fact and trying to almost get out of this termination.
What would it look like then if they have come to you to say, I've got X, Y, and Z issues, and they would be otherwise protected, and as a result, they lash out, act out at work?
You can still discipline them for that lash out, as Amanda said, zero tolerance.
Right.
But in the interim, if they said, hey, I have anxiety, depression, that leads to anger management, and I need to be on these meds, obviously reasonable accommodation will allow them to be on that medicine. As long as you're taking those steps to help them accommodate that disability, if you can, down the road, you can still discipline them if they do end up lashing out or becoming aggressive. So another quick situation I want to cover is the situation where you're going to terminate an employee on, for example, a Friday afternoon, who you have suspicion may become violent or aggressive upon hearing the news of their termination. In those situations, always best to try to conduct that termination with a witness present, and then try to do it away from the other employees, maybe at the end of the day when everyone else has gone home, or a lot of the employees have gone home, just to avoid those disruptions with those other employees present. Nothing stops you from, calling the police, having them just on site to maybe remedy a situation, otherwise having your building security guard there to remedy a situation. So I think that's all we have for you today on this second episode of Deviance in the Workplace, again covering violence and aggression. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you are notified when those other 3 episodes post over the next 3 weeks, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
Thank you.